The morning sun painted the red earth of New Mexico territory in shades of copper and gold, but Martha Colwell saw only the dust settling on her husband's grave. 3 months had passed since Thomas was buried beneath the twisted mesquite tree behind their small ranch house, yet the ache in her chest felt as fresh as the day Sheriff Clayton Wade had knocked on her door with that cold, practiced expression. "Accident," he'd said, his badge catching the light like a warning. "Horse threw him off near Devil's Canyon. Terrible shame, Mrs. Colwell." But Martha knew her husband. Thomas had been riding horses since he could walk, had broken mustangs that would buck seasoned cowboys into the dirt. The idea of him being thrown seemed as unlikely as rain in August. Now, standing in the general store in Red Mesa, she felt the familiar weight of suspicious stares. The townspeople's conversations died when she entered, replaced by uncomfortable shuffling and averted eyes. Behind the counter, Samuel Morrison's weathered hands trembled slightly as he counted her change. "Mrs. Colwell," he said quietly, glancing toward the door, "you might want to, well, maybe it's time to consider moving on. Fresh start somewhere else." Martha's green eyes hardened. At 32, she was still young enough to start over, but something deeper than grief kept her rooted to this harsh land. "This is my home, Sam. Thomas and I built something here." "Thomas is gone," Morrison whispered urgently, "and some folks, they're saying maybe it's best you remember that." The bell above the door chimed, and the store fell silent. Sheriff Wade filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking the sunlight. At 55, Clayton Wade was a man who commanded respect through fear rather than honor. His gray mustache was perfectly trimmed, his uniform immaculate, but his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. "Morning, Mrs. Colwell," he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Sam." Morrison nodded nervously and busied himself arranging canned goods that were already perfectly aligned. Wade approached the counter with measured steps, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. "I hear you've been asking questions around town about your husband's accident." Martha's hand tightened on her small purse, but her voice remained steady. "A wife has a right to understand how her husband died." "Indeed she does." Wade's smile was thin and sharp. "And I've told you everything there is to know. Sometimes, Mrs. Colwell, the truth is just that simple. Horses are unpredictable creatures. Thomas wasn't an unpredictable man." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Wade leaned against the counter, his presence overwhelming the small space. "Grief can make a person see shadows where there ain't none. Make them imagine conspiracies where there's just plain old bad luck." Martha met his stare without flinching. "And power can make a man think he's above accountability." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Morrison made a small, strangled sound and retreated further behind his counter. Wade's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Careful, Mrs. Colwell. This territory can be harsh on folks who don't know their place." "My place is wherever I choose to stand, Sheriff." Wade straightened slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Your husband thought the same thing. Look where it got him." The admission was so subtle, so carefully wrapped in implications, that anyone listening might have mistaken it for concern. But Martha heard the threat underneath, saw the satisfaction in Wade's eyes as her face went pale. "You—" she began, but Wade was already moving toward the door. "Have a pleasant day, Mrs. Colwell, and remember what I said about shadows." He paused at the threshold. "They have a way of swallowing folks who chase them too long." After he left, the store remained silent, except for the ticking of Morrison's old clock. Martha's hands shook as she gathered her purchases, but her resolve had crystallized into something harder than the desert stone. That evening she sat on her porch as the sun bled crimson across the western sky. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, a coyote called to its pack. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned together, about the justice that seemed as elusive as water in the desert. She had no allies in town. Wade's influence ran too deep, no weapons except an old rifle Thomas had taught her to use for hunting rabbits. No proof except the growing certainty in her heart that her husband had died because he'd discovered something Wade couldn't afford to have known. But she had something else. She had nothing left to lose. As the first stars appeared overhead, Martha Colwell made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would confront Clayton Wade directly, alone if necessary, because some fights were worth having, even if you couldn't win them, especially if you couldn't win them. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into Martha's bones as she prepared for what might be her last day. She dressed carefully in her best black dress, the one she'd worn to Thomas's funeral, and pinned her auburn hair back severely. If she was going to make her stand, she would do it with dignity. Before leaving the ranch, she walked to Thomas's grave one final time. The wooden cross he'd carved for their first anniversary now marked his resting place, weathered but still standing strong against the desert wind. "I'm going to find out what really happened to you," she whispered, placing her hand on the sun-warmed wood. "Even if it kills me." The ride into Red Mesa felt longer than usual, each hoofbeat of her mare echoing like a countdown. Word had spread quickly about yesterday's confrontation in the general store. As she passed the outlying homesteads, she saw curtains twitch in windows and conversations halt on porches. Fear had settled over the community like dust after a windstorm. The town square was busier than normal for a Wednesday morning. Too busy. Martha realized with growing unease that people had come to watch. They lined the wooden sidewalks and gathered in small clusters, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. Some looked ashamed, others excited. All of them were waiting. Sheriff Wade stood in the center of the square, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, surrounded by 3 of his deputies. He'd positioned himself deliberately, Martha realized, with the courthouse behind him and escape routes blocked. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a public execution of her reputation, if not her body. Martha dismounted near the water trough, her movements deliberate and calm despite the tremor in her hands. The crowd pressed closer, creating a rough circle around the confrontation that was about to unfold. She could hear whispered bets being placed on how long she would last. "Mrs. Colwell," Wade called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "I hear you wanted to speak with me. Something about justice, wasn't it?" She walked toward him with measured steps, her chin raised despite the weight of dozens of stares. "I want the truth about my husband's death, Sheriff. The real truth." "Yeah." Wade's laugh was cold and theatrical, designed for the audience. "Still chasing those shadows, I see. Ma'am, your husband died in an accident. That's been established." "By you," Martha replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "The same man who's been buying up land from families who mysteriously find themselves in trouble with the law. The same man who's turned this town into his personal kingdom." A murmur ran through the crowd. Wade's expression darkened, and his deputies shifted nervously. Martha pressed on, knowing she had moments before he decided she'd said too much. "Thomas found something, didn't he? Something about the silver mine claims you've been manipulating. Something about the families you've driven off their land." "That's a serious accusation," Wade said, his hand moving closer to his gun. "Slanderous, even. The kind of talk that can get a person into real trouble. The kind of trouble that gets you thrown from a horse." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Wade's face had gone rigid, and Martha could see the calculation in his eyes. He was deciding whether to arrest her, shoot her, or simply let his reputation do the work for him. You're grief-stricken, Mrs. Caldwell, not thinking clearly. I'm going to give you one chance to apologize for these wild accusations and go home quietly. I'm not going anywhere until I get answers." Wade nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "Then I'm afraid I'll have to place you under arrest for disturbing the peace and making false accusations against a peace officer." He gestured to his deputies, who began to close in. The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held her ground. This was it. This was how her story would end. Alone in the dust, with no one willing to stand beside her. Then she heard it. The soft sound of footsteps on packed earth, steady, purposeful, coming from behind her. The crowd's murmur died to nothing. Even Wade's deputies froze mid-step, their eyes fixed on something over Martha's shoulder. She felt a presence beside her, tall, silent, radiating a quiet strength that seemed to change the very air around them. A voice spoke, deep and calm, with the weight of mountains behind it. "She's not alone now." Martha turned to see him for the first time. He was Apache, perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through his black hair and lines etched deep around his dark eyes, lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. He wore simple clothes, a mix of traditional and Western styles, but he carried himself with the dignity of a chief. There was something familiar about him, though Martha was certain they'd never met. The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. Some people stepped back involuntarily. Others whispered to each other in nervous, excited tones. Wade's confidence faltered for just a moment, long enough for Martha to see that he recognized this man, and that the recognition worried him. "Joseph Running Bear," Wade said, his voice carefully controlled. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Many things happen that we don't expect, Sheriff," Joseph replied, his English precise and unaccented. "Sometimes the land itself calls us to witness." Wade's hand hovered near his gun, but something held him back. The dynamics of the confrontation had shifted completely. What had been a powerful man intimidating a defenseless widow was now something else entirely, something more dangerous for everyone involved. "This is none of your concern, Joseph. This is a matter between me and Mrs. Caldwell." Joseph's dark eyes never left Wade's face. When injustice walks in the daylight, it becomes everyone's concern. Martha felt something pass between the two men, an old knowledge, an old wound. There was history here, layers of pain and conflict that ran deeper than her husband's death. She realized that Joseph Running Bear hadn't just happened upon this confrontation. He'd come here deliberately, knowing what she was planning to do. The question was, why? Wade seemed to be asking himself the same thing. His deputies looked uncertainly between their boss and the Apache warrior, who had appeared like a desert spirit to stand beside their target. The crowd waited, sensing that this moment would be talked about for years to come. "Walk away, Mrs. Caldwell," Wade said finally, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Take your new friend and walk away, before this goes somewhere none of us want it to go." Martha looked at Joseph, then back at Wade. She could feel the town holding its breath. "I'm not walking away," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Joseph nodded almost imperceptibly, and Martha knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The storm was gathering, and the first thunder was still to come. The standoff in the town square stretched taut as a bowstring, with Martha and Joseph on one side and Sheriff Wade with his deputies on the other. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the electric tension that seemed to make the very air shimmer with possibility. Wade's calculating mind was working furiously. Arresting a grieving widow was one thing, the townspeople might whisper, but they wouldn't act. But Joseph Running Bear was different. He was the son of a respected Apache leader, a man who had walked between two worlds with dignity and tact. More importantly, he was someone Wade couldn't simply make disappear without consequences that reached far beyond Red Mesa. "This doesn't concern you, Joseph," Wade repeated, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Joseph's response was quiet, but carried clearly across the square. 3 years ago, my sister came to this town. She was traveling to join her husband's family in Colorado. She never arrived. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Martha saw several people exchange meaningful glances, and she realized that others had suspected, had perhaps even known, but had been too afraid to speak. Wade's face had gone carefully blank. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof?" "I have what your people call circumstantial evidence," Joseph replied with bitter irony. "A horse found wandering. Personal items discovered near Devil's Canyon. The same canyon where accidents seem to happen with unusual frequency." Martha's breath caught. Devil's Canyon, the same place where Thomas had supposedly been thrown from his horse. She looked at Joseph with new understanding. They weren't just united by a desire for justice, they were united by identical wounds. "You can't prove anything," Wade said, but his hand had moved closer to his gun. "Perhaps not in your courts," Joseph agreed. "But truth has a way of revealing itself, Sheriff. Sometimes it just needs the right moment." From her position between the two men, Martha could see the fear starting to crack Wade's carefully maintained facade. He was a man accustomed to controlling narratives, to being the only voice that mattered. But now he faced two people who had nothing left to lose, and that made them dangerous in ways he couldn't predict or control. "Mrs. Caldwell," Wade said, turning his attention back to her, "I'm giving you one final chance. Go home. Mourn your husband properly. Stop this nonsense before it gets people hurt." Martha felt Joseph's steady presence beside her like an anchor in a storm. For months, she'd felt like she was drowning in grief and helplessness. But now, standing here with someone who understood her pain, she found strength she didn't know she possessed. "Tell me about the land deals, Sheriff," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Tell me about the mining claims. Tell me why every family that's had an accident happened to own property you wanted." The crowd stirred uneasily. These were dangerous waters, the kind of truths that people whispered about but never spoke aloud. But Martha had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Wade's patience finally snapped. "That's enough." He gestured sharply to his deputies. "Arrest them both. Disturbing the peace, making false accusations, conspiracy to incite unrest." The deputies moved forward reluctantly, their hands on their weapons, but their faces uncertain. They were local men, born and raised in Red Mesa. They'd grown up hearing stories about Joseph's family, about the treaties and the broken promises, about the delicate balance that kept the peace in this corner of the territory. Joseph didn't move as they approached, but something in his stillness suggested coiled power, like a mountain cat preparing to spring. "Be very careful, Sheriff," he said quietly. "My people know I'm here. They know why I came. If something happens to me, if I disappear like your other inconvenient problems, they will come looking for answers." Wade hesitated. The threat was real. Joseph's father, Chief Running Bear, commanded respect among several Apache bands, and he had influential friends in the territorial government. A mysterious death or disappearance would bring scrutiny Wade couldn't afford. But backing down publicly would be almost as dangerous to his position. He was trapped between bad options, and Martha could see him calculating the odds, looking for a way out that preserved his power. Then salvation arrived from an unexpected source. Dr. Henry Reeves, the town's physician, and one of the few men Wade couldn't intimidate, pushed through the crowd carrying his medical bag. "Sheriff Wade," he called out, slightly out of breath. "We need to talk, now." Wade turned, irritation flashing across his features. "Not now, Doc. I'm busy." "It's about Thomas Colwell," Reeves said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square, "and about things I should have said 3 months ago." The words hit like lightning. Martha felt her knees weaken, and only Joseph's subtle movement closer to her kept her upright. Wade's face had gone ashen, but he couldn't silence the doctor without confirming everyone's suspicions. "What about Thomas Colwell?" Wade asked through gritted teeth. Dr. Reeves looked around the crowd, his conscience clearly warring with his fear. He was 68 years old, with grown children and grandchildren to think about. But he was also a man who had taken an oath to do no harm, and his silence had been eating at him for months. "The injuries on his body," Reeves said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the hushed square. They weren't consistent with being thrown from a horse. The pattern of damage, the location of the wounds. I've seen enough riding accidents to know the difference. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Martha felt the world tilt around her as 3 months of suspicion crystallized into certainty. Joseph's hand touched her elbow gently, steadying her. Wade's careful control finally cracked completely. "You're overstepping, Doc. Way overstepping." "Am I?" Reeves asked, finding courage in the moment. "Then why did you tell me never to discuss my findings? Why did you threaten to run me out of town if I asked too many questions?" The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Wade realized too late that he'd been maneuvered into a trap of his own making. By threatening the doctor, he'd confirmed the conspiracy. By trying to silence questions, he'd made the truth inevitable. Martha found her voice, stronger now than it had been all morning. "What really happened to my husband, Dr. Reeves?" The old physician looked at her with eyes full of regret and compassion. "He was beaten to death, Mrs. Colwell. Badly beaten, then placed at Devil's Canyon to make it look like an accident. I've carried that knowledge for 3 months, and I can't carry it anymore." Wade's hand was on his gun now, his pretense of civilization completely abandoned. "You've just signed your death warrant, old man." But Joseph stepped forward, placing himself between Wade and the doctor. "No," he said simply, "the dying stops here." The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Wade faced a crowd that now knew the truth, backed by 2 people who wouldn't be intimidated, and challenged by a doctor who had found his courage at last. His power, built on fear and silence, was crumbling in the harsh desert sunlight. Martha looked around at the faces in the crowd, some shocked, some knowing, all of them waiting to see what would happen next. The truth was out now. The question was, what would they do with it? The storm had finally broken, but the real battle was just beginning. The revelation hung over the town square like the calm before a dust storm. "Doctor." Reeves' confession had shattered the fragile illusion of order that Sheriff Wade had maintained for years, and now everyone faced the consequences of truth spoken aloud. Wade's hand rested on his gun, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The crowd pressed closer, no longer spectators, but potential actors in a drama that could reshape their community forever. Martha could see the calculation in his eyes. He was looking for an escape route, a way to salvage his position or at least survive the day. "Doc's getting old," Wade said desperately, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Confused, making up stories. You all know me. I've kept this town safe for 15 years. But the spell was broken. Samuel Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered hands shaking, but his voice steady. "Safe for who, Clayton? Safe for you and your cronies while the rest of us lived in fear?" Others began to speak up, years of suppressed grievances spilling out like water from a broken dam. Stories of intimidation, of convenient accidents, of families driven away and properties seized. The pattern that Martha and Joseph had suspected was laid bare by a dozen different voices. Wade's deputies looked increasingly uncomfortable. These weren't outsiders making accusations. These were their neighbors, their family members, people they'd grown up with. Deputy Miller, barely 22 and new to the job, holstered his weapon and stepped back from his boss. "I didn't sign up for this," Miller said quietly. "If what they're saying is true—" "It's all lies," Wade snarled, but his voice cracked with desperation. "Lies and gossip from people too weak to make their own way in this territory." Joseph moved slightly, his presence calm but commanding. "I've listened to your words for years, Sheriff, listened to your promises about justice and law, but I've also seen the bodies, my sister, Thomas Colwell. How many others?" The question struck home. Martha watched Wade's face cycle through rage, fear and calculation before settling on something that chilled her blood. The cold determination of a man with nothing left to lose. "You want to know about justice?" Wade asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire square. "I'll show you frontier justice." His hand moved toward his gun with deadly intent, but he'd underestimated the people he'd terrorized for so long. 3 voices shouted warnings simultaneously, and suddenly everyone was moving. Joseph was faster than Martha would have thought possible, his body slamming into Wade's arm just as the sheriff's pistol cleared its holster. The gun fired into the air, sending the crowd scattering, but several townspeople moved forward instead of back. Morrison grabbed Wade's other arm, while Deputy Miller actually drew his own weapon, pointing it at his former boss. "Drop it, Sheriff," Miller commanded, his young voice shaking but determined. "Drop it now." Wade fought like a cornered animal, but he was outnumbered and off balance. Joseph's grip on his gun arm was like iron, and more townspeople surged forward to help restrain him. The other 2 deputies looked at each other, then at the crowd, and made the same calculation Miller had. Their loyalty to Wade wasn't worth dying for. When the dust settled, Wade was on his knees in the dirt, his gun in Joseph's hands, and his authority shattered forever. Martha stood over him, feeling no satisfaction in his defeat, only the hollow ache of losses that could never be recovered. "It's over," she said quietly. Wade looked up at her with eyes full of hatred. "You think this changes anything? You think killing me brings your husband back?" "No," Martha replied. "But it means he didn't die for nothing." The aftermath moved quickly. Deputy Miller, revealing a moral strength no one had expected, took charge of securing Wade and his remaining loyal deputies. Dr. Reeves agreed to provide written testimony about Thomas's injuries, and several townspeople came forward with their own stories of Wade's corruption. As the crowd began to disperse and order slowly returned to Red Mesa, Martha found herself walking beside Joseph toward the edge of town. They moved in comfortable silence, 2 people bound by shared loss and shared purpose. "What happens now?" Martha asked as they reached the cemetery where Thomas was buried. Joseph considered the question carefully. "The territorial government will send someone to investigate. There will be trials, testimony, justice of a sort." He paused. "But the real work is rebuilding trust, rebuilding community. That takes longer." Martha nodded, understanding. The corruption was exposed, but healing the wounds it had left would take years. "Will you stay to help with that work?" "For a while," Joseph agreed. "My sister deserves justice too, and there are others who need their stories told." He looked at her with respect, and something that might have been friendship. "What about you? Will you stay?" Martha looked out over the harsh, beautiful landscape that had taken so much from her but had also revealed strength she didn't know she possessed. "This is my home," she said simply. "Thomas and I built something here worth preserving." As the sun began to set over the red earth of New Mexico territory, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, Martha Colwell and Joseph Running Bear stood together at the edge of a new beginning. They had faced down corruption and violence with nothing but truth and courage. They had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stand alone. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the gathering dusk a coyote called to its pack. But for the first time in months, Martha heard it not as a cry of loneliness, but as a song of community, of voices calling out to each other across the darkness, saying, "You are not alone." Behind them, the lights of Red Mesa began to flicker on, one by one, like stars emerging in a clearing sky. The town would rebuild. The people would remember this day and the courage it had taken to speak truth to power, and Martha Colwell and Joseph Running Bear would be remembered as the two people who refused to let injustice triumph, who stood together when standing alone seemed impossible. The widow had faced the sheriff, and she had not faced him alone. Justice, it turned out, was not a destination, but a journey. One best traveled with companions who understood that some fights are worth having, some truths are worth telling, and some stands are worth taking, no matter the cost. As darkness settled over the territory, it carried with it the promise of a new dawn.